Right, welcome back everyone. I've been joined by our panel who will be discussing the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Bristol. To very briefly introduce them, we're joined by Sam, who's from Science Creates Ventures, Jane, who is the Deputy Director of Enterprise at the Quantum Technology Enterprise Centre, Marty, who is the Head of Engine Shed, Bryony, who's the ScaleUp Lead from Rocket Makers, and our Chair is Musty, who's the Director of Enterprise Services at the University of Bristol. Do add your questions into the chat box or raise your hand by clicking the hand button at the bottom of the screen, and then we'll bring you up to the stage to ask your question live. I'm going to pass over to Musty, who's going to be able to begin the session. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kim. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having us here. And the panel is going to try and answer the question: how is Bristol supporting its growing deep technology industry? And together we have some of the folks who are doing that right now. So maybe I'll just say a little bit about me. My name's Musty Rampuri. I'm the Director of Enterprise Services and also Director of Bristol Quantum Technologies Innovation Centre. So quantum, deep tech, that's my bag. Then I'll hand over to Jane. Maybe Jane, you can give us a little intro about yourself and what you're up to. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Musty. Okay, so I'm Jane Garrett. I'm Deputy Director for Enterprise at QTech, Quantum Technology Enterprise Centre, as opposed to the IC, which is the Innovation Centre. I'm relatively new to Bristol. 4 years ago when QTech started, I arrived. I came in from Western Australia, where I'd been for 10 years working on entrepreneurial programmes. Prior to that, I had 21 years in Cambridge, where I was involved in the tech ecosystem, and I built my own startup from inception through to a float on London's AIM. And that's how I learned entrepreneurship the hard way. I have the scars to prove it. And Musty tells me, after my introduction, to hand over to Bryony. So it's ladies first.
Smoothly done, Jane. Hello, everyone. My name's Bryony Phillips. My official job title most of the week is as Scale-Up Lead at Rocket Makers. So I wear a number of different hats, I suppose, across the work that I do. And that's the first one. So trying to make sure our region is a great place for companies to grow and thrive, and doing that through the lens of a software development agency who builds technology for fast growth companies and also for big innovative enterprises as well. I wear two other hats, just briefly, one of which is working in partnership with TechSpark as investment activator, which is a program intended to help more companies to access equity investment across the region. And then finally, and less relevant to this session, I also wear a hat as a nutritional therapist, where I help people to feel better using food. So Sam, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bryony. Hello, everyone. My name's Sam Olaf. So I was in Bristol from 2005 through to 2013 and did my undergraduate in chemistry there and my postgraduate as part of the first sort of push to get multidisciplinary scientists trained. So that was through the then Bristol Centre for Functional Nanomaterials. I left for 7 years to go and work as a part of the Oxford and London ecosystem. So initially I was an academic in the chemistry department at Oxford. We started a company out of the chemistry department there, 3D printing artificial tissues, and ran that for a number of years. Alongside that, we also started a consultancy advising small technical companies on translation, and increasingly we got pulled into the funding ecosystem, so advising venture funds on what risk looks like in small companies. That led me back to Bristol at the start of this year. Harry Destakrar, who's my colleague, called me sort of in December and said Bristol needs a dedicated venture fund to support its burgeoning ecosystem. And in the sort of 6 or 7 years since I've been there, it went from having no opportunities to suddenly having 42 companies down and around Unit DX. And yeah, since April, we've been working on that project full time, raising a dedicated fund to support deep tech. So we're really excited to be launching that in the next couple of weeks officially. So I'll hand over to Marty now.
Hi, so I'm Marty Reed. I'm head of Engine Shed. Engine Shed is an enterprise hub right in the centre of Bristol. It's run by University of Bristol, but we work very closely in partnership with the City Council and a whole range of partners in the city to try and deliver projects that create economic impact and inclusive economic growth, not least of which we run the Setsquare Bristol incubator, which I think a lot of people have covered on today, but all about supporting tech founders to be successful on their journey.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, panel. Maybe I could start by first just covering a few of the issues that people often talk about, in terms of training, infrastructure, and the network in order to build up your grouping of people who might join you in your ventures. But there was a couple of important points that you've already raised there about funding and equity and how you be inclusive in your new ventures. So I was just wondering, maybe we could start by thinking about training, and maybe given that Jane runs a training organisation, perhaps Jane, you'd like to just give us a little bit of indication of how training impacts on our ability to establish deep tech businesses.
Sure, happy to. If I can sort of go back to my own personal experiences from nearly 20 years ago, it's a long time. I went into entrepreneurship the hard way, absolutely no training whatsoever. I learned on the job. It was a software business, so it wasn't actually taking tech from the lab and taking it out to market. So its development time was somewhat shorter. But I think I sort of fell into every trap an entrepreneur can fall into, like trusting the wrong people, talking to the wrong investors and not presenting properly. I remember walking into my very first presentation where they said, well, tell me about your business. And I was totally unprepared. I had no presentation and I just rambled. So clearly I didn't get that investor netted. And so all of those little soft skills that you need in terms of finding the right people and understanding what you need to do to build a business and then to present that business in order to raise capital is vitally important. And how else do you find that other than by being trained or having somebody you can go to who's a mentor, who's been through the process before, that can actually help and guide you on the way. And if you're listening to Andy's presentation, he brought that out very clearly at the beginning, that you need people along that journey to help and guide you who've been along the path before. But one thing he said is no one person can have all the skills you need. So it's that team of people. So yes, QTech, we take people from a academic background and we turn them into the CXOs of the deep tech companies that are coming out the other end. And I'm a firm believer that academics make the best CTOs, CEOs, in fact, of these deep tech startups. So I've probably said enough there. I'll let somebody else jump in.
I just pick up a little bit on what Caroline and James and David were saying in terms of what really struck me was their personal experiences and how different they all are. And I think the first challenge in terms of finding training is knowing yourself well enough to know your weaknesses, and perhaps thinking about it kind of picks up on what you're saying, Jane, just understanding what your truly authentic self is and how to identify the gaps in that, and whether that's about leaning on your network to find support, or whether it's about finding training to enable you to feel more comfortable and confident in those different things, whether it's around learning how to pitch and being able to conquer that challenge or anything else. I think that kind of personalization aspect is really important in training. And that's why, for me, when I look at the ecosystem locally, I think about each of the programs. On the whole, a lot of the training is run through a kind of cohort-based program, and that's about really the organizations and the leaders of those programs understanding those individuals and being able to tailor the support and the advice, I think, and support that they provide. There are, of course, loads, like a list as long as my arm, of fantastic online resources that people can use to kind of give them that first leg up, whether it's the Digital Business Academy from Tech Nation, or the stuff that comes out of Y Combinator in the States, the Startup School. Some of those things are going to give you the 101 in entrepreneurship, the real basics, but actually, kind of leaning on the network and finding some personalized support feels like a really important part of that too.
And just add one little bit to that, sorry, Musty.
Right.
Just an example of that is Matt Hutchins, who's the CEO of Seek. He didn't attend one single QTech training course program. He was out spending his budget, doing the flights to the US, trying to do the deal with the US company Hypros in order to spin out Seek. So you were totally right, Brian. It's very, very individual. It's what does that person need? with that, I'm sorry, I'll shut up.
That's okay. Maybe we can go to Marty and then on to Sam then to kind of get your thoughts on one training, and then maybe a little bit on the access to funding as well.
Sure. Like I said, echo firstly the need for a slightly bespoke approach to training, particularly around the deep tech space, just because the sheer diversity of companies. You know, some of the accelerator programs that came around initially and are a bigger scale tend to be based on a fixed program over a period of time, often rushing to an investment point quite early. And they tended to be grown out of, you know, the e-commerce businesses, some fintech type businesses, and that just doesn't fit when you're trying to take technology from lab bench into a business. And in that transition, I think the key and most important bit of training that we get across, different from individuals, is letting founders or helping founders decouple their passion, you know, their heart and soul that they've put into why their technology to them is revolutionary, to understanding what the value is to others, and particularly those that might be looking at it from a purely investment or financial point of view. I'm going to shamelessly pinch something you actually retweeted earlier, Bryony, I think from a different session. Understanding what is our right to exist. And I think helping founders going that journey to step past them seeing their own technology and their passion for changing the world to being a business concept or a model that investors would understand.
Thanks, Marty. And Sam, from your perspective as someone who's been through the university, you know, done your own thing, and now come back into Bristol to join the network, as it were, and establish a fund. I mean, what's your take on the need for training to support deep technology industries and that relationship and interplay with the access to funding?
Yeah, thanks, Mustafa, and to the panel members. I think I'd echo all of the sentiments, and just again to sort of be 100% transparent. So the fund, the sort of opening mission statement is that we think there's 3 key elements to build successful deep tech companies: funding, expert mentorship, and purpose-built facilities. So mentorship is front and center. I think there's a basic hygiene level of background knowledge you need. So, you know, it's what's your responsibilities as a director, how to work out your P&L, you know, how to run a safe lab environment if it's work chemistry. And I think those things can be taught, but I think there's a strong environmental component where you learn on the job. You take mentorship from other people that are running companies, because I think knowledge has a shelf life. And I think the most impactful mentors I had were other CEOs, CSOs, CTOs when I was running a tech company, because they're not trying to sell you anything. They've often lived the same experience. And I think actually pulling the fund together, and again, Martin, just to read between the lines, I was an entrepreneur in residence at EF up in London. And so, you know, I saw those programs working, and I think there's a lot to be said for how much they cover. But I think they are quite honest that as soon as you get into niche or domains, they can only teach so much. And so a big part of my role in that last cohort was trying to get them into lab spaces, working safely, understanding what the resources on their doorstep were. And so I think a mixed approach to learning and mentorship, so some structured materials, some learning on the job, and being open with your black book, effectively trying to champion the talent we've got here. I think Bristol actually has got first album syndrome. We've got 20 years worth of untapped know-how often in these labs. And so all of the companies that we're looking at the moment have just this embarrassment of riches and know-how. And what we're trying to do is desperately sort of drag in people from Oxford, London, Cambridge to be advocates for the tech we've got here and spread that ripple. So that's kind of our position on it.
I think, can I just add, Musty, I think there's something important in there around access to funding, and maybe going back to something Jane said about in her experience about talking to the wrong investors, and particularly given the context of quantum and deep tech. Now, every founder who you speak to who is raised will say, you know, they had to pitch 50, 100 times to hit the ones they want. And that will probably always be the case. And we'll probably come on to all the programs and opportunities that we're trying to create to make that simpler, easier, more accessible. But I think working with founders to teach them and support them in finding the right type of investor is really key. Particularly around deep tech, the need for, I think we'd probably term it patient investment. Those that are going to work and support and give a guiding role in the business to develop over the timescales that's right for quantum and deep tech, that it's going to be a number of years before return, and it's likely to need further raises to commercialize, and that's okay because they're in it for the long term for the success.
And Marty and perhaps Jane, you can comment on this one as well. I mean, do we have sufficient access to that type of patient funding mechanism within our region? And if not, what can we do about it?
I'll probably defer to Brian in a second as the font of knowledge of kind of the stats and background from a role in the investment activator and scale-up programs. But from my point of view, I think we're certainly moving in the right direction, where we are today compared to 5 years ago, partly because I think of the critical mass of successful businesses that are being generated at the same time, the moving on of perspectives and greater interest in deep tech from a wider range of areas. But success breeds success as well. So I think we have a burgeoning reputation, but I think the stats will still say that we and our businesses have to go further afield and engage longer to get access to the funding that you might do if you were in the middle of London or say in the Golden Triangle.
Yeah. I mean, if we look at the range of investment VCs that are invested in the QTech businesses, they are Europe-wide. So they've got to have a look in terms of exactly what you said, is the right investor, the right investment criteria. We can't just look locally. It has to be further afield. Majority are UK, but obviously Matt with Seek, they're one of their founder investor was Blue Yard, I believe a German investor. So it's really looking at the criteria and just getting that match, rather than just saying, I'm going to look locally. Can I just sort of say, sorry, one other thing, which is relates to the Cambridge background. Cambridge has got the Cambridge Angels, and thankfully the Cambridge Angels are now beginning to look at the QTech businesses. That's educated money. It's people that have come from that deep tech background. They've been successful in their own businesses. They've now got deep pockets, and they're prepared to give back not only with money but also with their time. And that is something that I have yet to see within Bristol. And it might be that I've missed it, because you said that there are these people within these companies that we've not found yet, and I've not been here long enough, I've probably not found them. But that's something that I see missing within Bristol, and it needs to be found. It needs to be developed.
I'll jump in here. I think that's not 100% true, actually, Jane. I think it's not very well linked up at the moment, which is why we think there is call to unify. I think Bristol's actually got a surprisingly active angel network, so BPEC and others, and actually Bath represents the end of a corridor that started at Digital in Reading, sort of ex-Moss, Graphcore down into Bristol, of kind of software and telecoms talent. I think that's the strand that has really surprised me. And there's a lot of ultra high net worths who've made money out of those businesses in the 90s and the noughties, who have been actively investing in businesses in and around the Southwest. But again, I think it's quite sector specific. So if you're not blue chip telecoms, you probably would never have met them. But I think they're there, and actually there's an interest in deep tech and life science where it overlaps with deep tech, but there's just a nervousness around the high complexity of these businesses and understanding what good looks like. And so I think I would say there is the beginnings of that momentum.
And that is borne out in the data, I think. So as far as our community of ultra high net worth individuals, I think we come third. So it's London, then the Southeast, and the Southwest. So there's a huge number of them around, and they are quietly making the investments, I think, but largely through their own network. So the data, which is a year or two old now, but from the UK Business Angels Association, suggests that 85% of our ultra high net worth individual investment is going into the Golden Triangle, so going back to Cambridge, Oxford and London. And so I think what Sam's saying in terms of they're here, and if they are engaged in the right way and that community is built in the right way, then I think the potential is there. I think what hopefully UnitDX and Science Creates Ventures is going to do is to give them the confidence to be able to invest beyond their own subject matter expertise, because it's bringing a community of people together who can share in that and direct those investments. Having said all of that, I think, you know, we are very lucky in that we do have active angels. Yeah, BPEC's great. They've been around for 3 or 4 years. They've done a significant number of deals. They see 20 deals a year, but those are across many different sectors. So obviously it's not all for deep tech and health sciences or quantum. But we do mostly see angels connecting with the nodes. So if you think about the kind of ecosystem nodes, like Setsquare Bath will have their own black book, Setsquare Bristol will have theirs, UnitDX has got one too, and Future Space has got another, and so on and so forth. And there are kind of key pillars in the community, individuals who've got a little black book of investors. And if you find those right people who are willing to be that super connector and connect you into the right people they think might be interested in investing, then you're away. But I think, you know, all of that infrastructure is kind of building up and has been over the last couple of years, a lot more so than it ever had done before, but it's still got a way to go. And I think the very fact that we haven't had a fund as a region, I know it's been kind of talked about a lot, but the closest we got was Eden Ventures, and the work that Mike Jackson did through his fund as well, which was a few years ago now. But so I feel like that's a big step forward for us and a big opportunity. And there's a couple of funds potentially going to be launched in the kind of next 6-month periods that I know of, one of which obviously Sam's here to represent, which is great.
Brilliant. And to what extent do you think deal flow matters in attracting the investment and promoting the region and supporting the I guess an emerging or burgeoning deep tech industry here?
For me, it's absolutely vital. And I think, yeah, as Sam mentioned 42 companies earlier, I think, you know, that kind of growing community is really significant in terms of deal flow. And that's it's a game of two halves, I think. And actually finding the deal flow partly comes from knowing that the capital's there too. But ultimately, for me, it's the opaque nature of that deal flow at the moment. So the work we're trying to do through the investment activator is to try and bring together the different deals, which might be through Setsquare, it might be through Future Space or others, QTech, you know, whomever, but really just trying to level the playing field and say, look, there's 26 companies this quarter all looking for investment right now, ranging from 100 grand to 2 million. But here's, you know, your jumping off point to contact those founders if you want to, because that's what we find in London, is that the analysts from the big funds, who are the people we want to attract, will find the deals if they're big enough and they're hearing about them enough. And so just trying to level that playing field a bit is what we're trying to do.
Sam, you were going to jump in there as well on that one.
Yeah, well, I was just going to confirm that deal flow is the thing that most investors are interested in. They want to know that there's, well, I mean, from a few perspectives, they want to. It's quite common to raise a fund and then worry about deals. I think actually Harry and I have found we've got the opposite problem, is that having played in this space for 7 or 8 years now, we know a fair number of CEOs, CTOs, and so actually we've got about between 50 and 70 companies that we've kind of been talking to. That isn't just the Southwest. I would say it covers a much broader region than that. And so deal flow is not the worry. Actually, as soon as you set up a fund structure, you realize that even with all the best will in the world, you can only make a dent. And I think actually, to Bryony's point, it's around sort of putting a flag down and saying, okay, there is great talent and great companies here. This is what a first fund looks like. It just creating, as you said, supporting those nodes and consolidating it will attract others. I think it's interesting, the point about the density of high net worths and also smart people. I would say Bristol and the Southwest has a great attrition rate. I didn't want to leave in 2012. I left because I couldn't find a job. And so I think it's the same for the kind of high net worths. You know, there's great quality of life here, great schools. And so they're there. I mean, we've been talking to an independent financial advisor, and there's 600 million in assets that they manage for people in the Southwest. And so, you know, even if only 10% of that is money that would be put into high risk ventures, that's a decent chunk of cash down the back of the sofa. And I do know other tech funds that are more actively looking, and we're trying to syndicate with. And so I think all of that will start to make the ecosystem more competitive. I think the other stat that we've been asked about recently is not only the diversity of the management teams, but also the numbers of people that have come back to Bristol or been attracted from outside of Bristol, and that's looking really positive. I'm reluctant to put a number to it, but you know, the 4 or 5 deals we're trying to paper at the moment, you know, I would say half of each of the management teams has come from outside the city, or the ecosystem will come back in, and I think that's a really positive sign for the quality of what's being done.
I was going to say, in terms of an element that gives me real optimism about the huge potential we have, and I'm going to be setting off a bit of Bristol bingo here by being first to talk about how collaborative we are. But I think it is worth going back to the Investment Activator programme that Bryony briefly mentioned. In that, we've brought together the 2 universities, the university's leading incubation programmes, law firms, I can't remember all the partners, but leaders from the business community, some of which are traditionally competitors and probably would be and are competitors, but would be very competitive and wouldn't play nicely together in other cities and other regions. And it's a pilot, but we've brought them together to try and collaboratively work to raise awareness, raise engagement, and to solve that problem of visibility of deal flow and awareness of the opportunities in the region. You know, we speak to BCs from London and they're saying, well, why should I prioritise looking at Bristol? There's cool things going on, but we could look at Manchester, we could look at others. You know, I need to sell this in when I'm trying to build the fund. When you start talking about the potential of, say, the Investment Activator and that collaborative approach, because we're of the size and have that spirit of pulling it together, you could start, you know, projecting deal flow and opportunities further down into the pipeline. And for a VC or a collective angels or others trying to put a fund together, if they can work with people to say, well, this is what's on offer now in the next 6 months, but then the next step in the next 18 months, this is the next stage of talent coming through. And we have confidence because we're working with those curators of the community that it's going to come through. That's incredibly powerful, especially if you can cut it by sector, to then attract those future funds and future investment. And that, I think that does make us a little bit special in what we are trying to do.
Thanks. So I guess what we've discussed here is that we've got talented people, access to the training programs to get people skilled up. We've got access to money and investors, and access to networks. So I guess that all that's left to really talk about is where can we support these people? How do we go about doing that? And maybe this is an opportunity, Marty. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about the engine shed and Setsquare, and Sam a little bit about Unit DX, and what are the opportunities for deep technology businesses to be anchored in this region?
For sure. And again, I'll try not to be too parochial about it because there's an incredible range of support programs in the city. And again, I can't remember, someone mentioned it earlier. I think that is something that's quite impressive. So through Setsquare, we provide business support to tech companies. It's bespoke. It's designed around them. It's not rushing through a program. It's supposed to give them the best chance of success. You know, previously I led a centre called Future Space, which has incredible facilities, and also a business support program very aimed at deep tech, hard technology like robotics and so on. That there is a real breadth of those things available in the city for any type and flavour of business. I think where we have an ongoing challenge around deep tech today is probably actually on the facility side, with the positive side of the emergence of more deep tech companies. We're still struggling in lab space, but that's what's really encouraging, that Unit DX is expanding with a second site. University of Bristol will bring on a huge amount of space in a couple of years' time through QTech at the new Temple Quarter campus. So hopefully that will broaden our capacity again. Really, yeah, I think all of the elements are there for this next stage of scaling up. As long as people can get into that, you know, find the right people and connect and get engaged, which I think has probably been a challenge for emerging founders right now, because virtual events and virtual networking probably won't replace all of the networking that we had before in person.
That's really interesting, and I guess maybe we could talk a little bit about what other relationships we have with other parts of the UK ecosystem that's available. But there is a question in the question box, and maybe we can go to that one first. And I think this is perhaps one relating to the QTech program. And Ezra Carlson asks, what is the relationship with Cranfield School of Management?
Okay. When QTech was started, it was set up as a collaboration, as you know, Musty, with Cranfield School of Management. They were to provide the entrepreneurial training at the beginning, but there were modules that were going to be utilised from their MBA programme for the QTech programme. And when I joined after the first cohort had started, I realised that it really wasn't in a logical order. And so it just wasn't going to work. Also, the spaces that were made available by Cranfield for the QTech Fellows were not always available. And so we made the decision that we develop our own program. And so 2 years in, I think we cancelled the contract with Cranfield, but Shaivar Khanam, who was involved at the very early stages of setting up QTech, we retained his services, and we still use Shai today as doing some of the teaching modules on QTech. And one thing I would add from earlier on, that it's practitioner-led. None of the teaching on QTech is academic. It's all people who, like we've mentioned before, they are the ex-CEOs of successful businesses, and they can talk to a subject.
And it's worth mentioning, perhaps, Musty, just on that Cranfield do feature on some of the blogs on the ScaleUp Generator. So I've done a fair amount of work to try and bring together input to help founders, particularly with their leadership journey. So I did an analysis of all the different programs that existed. And of course, Cranfield has a great growth program, which stands separate to the work that happens locally. But they were up there along with various others from all sorts of different providers like PwC and some of the banks as well.
Yes, it wasn't any criticism about the delivery from Cranfield whatsoever. It wasn't quite working for the way that we needed to deliver a program. So some great stuff happens there.
Sounds very entrepreneurial, Jane.
Cranfield.
So this is a question to the audience. If you have questions for this panel of experts that we have arranged here on this subject or other related subjects, then please do post them in the questions or the chat, and I'll be sure to ask them of the panel. In the meantime, I guess one of the key things that has often come up in discussions, and this is particularly related to Cambridge and the Golden Triangle, is around their ability to convene their network. And I wonder, to what extent Bristol being smaller, but beautifully formed, as it were, what could we do more about our network to kind of get more value out of it for these businesses and entrepreneurs?
I'll throw something in because it came up yesterday. So I was helping out with the Silicon Valley Comes to the UK, which is a 4-day digital summit, which is running this week. Yesterday, and I was in a roundtable conversation with Sherry Kutu, who lives in Cambridge and is a kind of key feature of the network there. And she was actually talking really very emphatically about the value of the dinners that the university hosts and brings together specifically for entrepreneurs. And I think there's something in that kind of generosity and paying it forward. I feel like in Bristol there's a kind of, we do what we can to patch things together and make do and mend, if you will, because we're trying to do things on a budget and make sure, and this isn't directed at any particular party, but all of us do it, I think, because we recognise that we want as much as possible the funding to go towards the companies who are going to benefit, not towards the support ecosystem. But I think sometimes there's value in perhaps bringing those communities together to spend time together. And one of those options is to have open spaces like Engine Shed, which I think is hugely valuable. I'm reading a book by Matthew Syed at the moment, which is about rebel ideas and where rebel ideas come from. And he talks liberally about the importance of physical proximity and spending time together and having conversations to recombine ideas and really be exposed to new stuff. And I think that might happen over dinner, or it might happen in spaces, but it's really hard to do online at the moment.
Yeah, isn't it? That COVID has kind of got in the way of our human nature. So we do have a couple of questions come in from Steve Hutson. I'd like to know how well you think that the industry and Bristol are doing at attracting people from poor backgrounds to learn and try deep tech. And I'll add to that. I guess it's not just about people from low prosperity areas, but also those from the productive margins and from communities who wouldn't normally engage with this type of technology. And so, what are we doing, and what more could we do in order to engage with those people? Maybe I'll go with Marty first, and then over to Brian and Sam.
Sure. I think the very first thing to say is that probably it's not been good enough. Being really open. If you look at any of the data sets, as Bristol has grown tremendously, and all of the exciting entrepreneurial activity that we're seeing and we're talking about and celebrating here today, it is really clear that it hasn't been equally shared amongst all parts of our society and community. There is an equity in it. So it is something that should be talked about openly and recognised as a challenge. There's lots of specific programs trying to address it in the problem in different ways, either short-term or long-term. For example, lots of different flavours of diverse workforce of the future programs, some of which are led out of the regional authority. The engine shed flavour was all about trying to get at school kid age, and that was actually in partnership with Unit DX and Ultraleap and a few others, all about bringing young people, particularly from schools in areas that tend not to be as included in the economics of the city centre, into work experience, be taught in engine shed for the day, have one-to-ones and engagements with founders of tech companies, quite often founders that are from backgrounds or from their areas. It's pretty, a really local example that gets used a lot. It's always really inspiring when Sammy Payne, founder of Open Bionics, talks about being from Knoll and how the companies that are being built here that are amazing and transforming industries are often built from people who are from here, and just trying to get that message out and break down that the barrier that isn't physical that exists at the front door. When you're on the inside of the community, it feels incredibly inclusive, incredibly collaborative and supportive. But we often hear, even about engine shed, there is a feeling of, is this for me to let me walk through the front door? So what we've actively been doing, and again, really difficult over the last few months, and we'd love ideas of how to best continue and make a difference in this during COVID, but has been to physically bring young people in and run coding workshops and things like that, just to show that these careers are for them. And actually, particularly with digital careers and things that are around deep tech businesses, whether you're the scientist or not, there is a career path in these companies for anyone, whether they're more creatively minded or more mathematically minded.
Yeah. Thanks, Marty. Brian, would you like to give a quick answer to that one? There's a few more questions in the chat that we'd like to get to.
Yeah, spotted, of course. No worries. I was going to pick up on Ben's question, actually. So he's asked about what normal people can do as well to make sure that we're raising the deep tech agenda across other communities. I think my biggest observation when I first arrived here about 2 or 3 years ago, maybe 4 now actually, was that it's very opaque. Once you're on the inside and you know what's going on, but it's a very opaque world to anyone else. And that was the observation that I heard from a lot of people who were, having open conversations with me as I went to speak to them about their scale-up journey. So yes, there's a vast number of diversity programs that exist in the region, and they are, the list is so long, I can't tell you. I don't think anyone's ever put the list together. In fact, it's that long. But it doesn't mean to say that they're necessarily working or supporting the right groups of people or enough people. I think there's always more to be done. And I think, yeah, it's very hard to spot them because they're jolly opaque.
Well, I think as well, the hopper that's feeding these industries is very biased already. So, to run a STEM company in this sector in deep tech, you've got a minimum criteria to even be allowed a seat at the table. I think both Harry and I came up through comprehensive schools, but we had entrepreneurs in our own family, lots of people that nudged us along the way. And so I think that we need to wait for the cycle to turn. I think the outreach work that UnitDX has done is amazing in terms of kind of presenting these centres as open places where you can come and engage, and same with Engine Shed. But that needs, 10 years to kind of feel the ripples. I think the other thing that we've talked about is that the more stuff we do for free, the more successful we tend to become. And so taking calls from young founders, from anyone in the 18 to 25 bucket who's trying to start these things on their side, and not necessarily having the first point of contact be someone that's trying to charge you for it or, take your equity. I think, even as a VC advocate here, in terms of creating competitive businesses, there has to be space for ideas to be tested and broken and fail and encourage the spirit of failure, because that's also something that we don't do very well in the UK. If you look in the US, I know, people who are not even 30 have had 3 companies, they've raised 25 million quid, they're on the next thing, and they won't have been successful to get there. And so I think it's about kind of encouraging that. And I would say that's one of the things that institutions like EF do quite well, is that they baseline, they give out stipends to come and attend these programs, so that irrespective of where you are in your professional journey, there's a kind of basic living wage that can cover you as you start taking this risk. And so I think there is still some economic tools that we could use to kind of encourage that as well.
Thank you.
Sorry, Brian.
So we have another a question from Len Kelleher. Who do you recommend as a first point of contact if an existing startup wants to explore opportunities in quantum? Maybe I can answer that one. That could be me, or Mike Payton, who is the program manager for quantum technologies at the University of Bristol, and he'll be speaking later. Or if you Google Quantum Bristol, you'll find CAT Labs, which is the Quantum Engineering Technology Labs, and there's a contact through there if you want to explore kind of more technological approaches or science type relationships, then that would be a good way in as well. Or more broadly, if you're interested in the national program, then through the UK national program, that there are ways through, and there is several special interest groups who can also help with that signposting through the KTN network, the IET, and the Royal Society as well. So there's plenty of doors, and I'm sure whichever one you press, they'll help signpost you to the right place.
Also, Musty.
And of course Jane and the QTech program, of course, and Kim, who is chairing all of this. So there's a whole heap of people here who can help bring you into to access quantum, the opportunities that quantum might have, and how that might be exploited within your own business, whether you're a quantum business or not. And of course there's Andy Collins too. So I don't know, loads of people who can help you with quantum stuff. And I was just going
to say on that, Musty, more broadly, I think if particularly with this session being recorded and all the sessions, the vast majority through Bristol Tech Festival being recorded, from engaging with most of the organisers and most of the speakers, while for sure there is some, business development-led activity in there, the vast majority are speaking and helping run these events because they want to open up and share the community in a wider circle. So anyone who was thinking the same thing about who to reach out to from any of the events, I'd honestly recommend just looking them up on LinkedIn, any of the speakers at the events or any of the organisers on LinkedIn, and asking. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised almost every case of the effort people will go to connect you to the right people, even if they aren't the right one.
It's a great shout, and that's why we have a network and how the network works. I'll take this one as probably the last question as we're sort of running out of time now. But Andrew Gray has asked, I'm interested in your views on how IP is exchanged for equity by universities and how frequently this becomes a significant problem for startups, and what model works best. I understand that various universities do different things. Okay, right. Who wants to take that one first?
I can jump in. I think Bristol does a really good job of it. The current state of the art from the university, which involves a very simple relationship that was sort of championed by Jackie Burnett, Hugh Brady, Harry had a hand in it as well, where there's a kind of a fixed chunk of equity that go to the university, and that's directly correlated to how much cost in kind, access to services, internal grants were leveraged. If you raise a certain amount of money, the license automatically gets offered across to the company that spins out the lab. I think it's simple. It can be executed in under a month. I think if you compare that to some of the stuff coming out of the Golden Triangle, some of those institutions have a lot to learn from that level of simplicity, I would say, and you deal with a single entity. I think it's something that should be emulated. I think Bristol's doing a great job at the moment. So that's my 2 cents.
I'll just come in, if I may, very quickly, not on Bristol, but from a QTech perspective, we have seen some very, very difficult equity deals being done that are taking a long time to negotiate, are quite exhausting, where the university wants to take huge amounts of equity, and that has caused problems for some of the QTech fellows. So there's a lot to be learned across the UK from the likes of Bristol. Cambridge also. When we have an Oxford company, it's got a very reasonable deal from Oxford Innovation.
I wonder. I think things are definitely improving within Bristol. 5 or 6 years ago, MIT did a review of what is the current state of the art of IP licensing in universities, and Bristol University was specifically mentioned as how not to do it. So we took that as a pallbearer for why we should change things, and as you point out, Sam, that Jackie and team have done an excellent job of creating a more simplistic approach. I mean, it's not perfect. I sometimes think that there is maybe a discrepancy in the narrative about how we decide what the value of IP is, and what it means to people as well. And so sometimes it's not is a straightforward kind of commercial transaction, because it's not always that one person has invented it, and you have to kind of marry up the feelings and the input that other people have made on those kind of IP creations, and although they may not be named on a patent, so it's quite tricky, and the university has to do its thing by the public purse that pays for most of the work that happens, and to be seen to be kind of fair and equitable, and operating within its charitable remit. That said, there are some very interesting methodologies out there that there's sort of golden share at 2% type approach, and but others are doing different things, and with different levels of success, and perhaps there just isn't a one size fits all approach to this. Marty, how have you seen this going through Setsquare, I wonder?
To be honest, in terms of, I probably don't have the specialist experience of this more than you've already mentioned or described. It is very dependent on the origin of the technology, the valuation of the technology, but it is a continual thing that I think will keep being a challenge, and that simplicity is probably the best way to go about it if we can.
Thank you. And Bryony, have you had any experience of this sort of stuff?
No, I'm keeping quiet and smiling sweetly. It's not my area of expertise.
Okay. Well,
just to pick up on your point, Mustafa, I would say mine was commenting from the last 6 months of what I'd seen relative to the other institutions. So I think all of the Russell Group has different ways of doing this and different established behaviours within the TTOs. I think generally speaking, just making the TTO interaction simpler is the thing that we tend to encourage, because there's so much asymmetry between the speed at which an entrepreneur and a founder wants to move and the speed at which a university needs to move. And obviously universities are set up to protect academic freedoms. They're paid for out of the public purse. But you're talking to someone who's probably going to not have a job if they don't get the IP out of their hands within 3 months to a year. And so I think there's there's a friction there that's almost impossible to kind of ameliorate. And so I think the only thing you can do is make it simple, make it transparent, and just sort of lead by example. And I think having these other institutions show how it can be done is useful, but again, I don't think it is a one-size-fits-all, because of, you know, medicalized technology will have one regulatory framework and a different pull and a time to market versus, you know, a software company. And so obviously the early stage levers you can pull in terms of commercial interest will be completely different, and therefore I think that makes the bargaining a bit open-ended. And so if you're an academic and your whole focus is on creating new and innovative ideas, the chances are you've probably not done an end-to-end market analysis or return on investment on a piece of IP. And so I think, again, that comes back to your first point about mentorship and knowing who to talk to help get some data points from that.
Ezra has just followed up, so we'll take this one as the last one, because I recognise we're already running over time. What if the translational science is developed in conjunction with a startup? Presumably that's related to an IP-related question here. Well, to kind of deal with that one quickly, presumably, thank you, follow on. If it's a relationship with a company between the university, then there ought to be an agreement in place, a collaboration agreement, or some kind of services agreement in place that will explicitly make clear what happens to the ownership of the IP that's generated on the back of that project. And there's two types of IP here. There's foreground IP and background IP. The background IP typically remains with whoever invented the background, and foreground goes to whoever typically invents the foreground. And that's usually how it's, I guess, codified in the agreement. Sometimes there's variations to that with different sort of license agreements backwards and forwards, but that's generally the principle. Anyway, it's been an absolutely fantastic discussion. I'd very much like to thank the panel for their time and their contributions here, and to say that was terrific. And back to Kim.
Yes, thanks so much to the panel for the time. I really enjoyed that session. So we're going to take a very quick break while we get our speakers up to introduce the Quantum Technology Innovation Centre. So we'll be back shortly. Thank you so much. Bye.